Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you. And tonight we have Dr. Jason Grinnell from the Philosophy Department. He's going to talk about a number of bioethical issues related to a project that we have.
Okay, so I'm Jason Grinnell. I don't want to sound petulant, but teach ethics in 45 minutes is kind of like, oh, teach me math in 45 minutes, right? I'll give you my best shot, but we're going to have to skip long division, okay? So, right, I'm giving you the 10,000 foot view. I'm hopeful that you'll have lots of questions for me. We can talk about pretty much anything you want. One of the great things about being an ethicist is nothing is a tangent, right? It's all my turf. So anything you want to talk about afterwards, I will happily dodge your questions. So first question. So what are we really talking about here? You can forget the reference to the ring of guidings, but my question for the person we just heard is really, why would you bother to report? And the answer is very straightforward, because you get in trouble if you don't, right? And the ring of Gyges is an old story that Plato actually brings up. And the ring of Gyges, long before Tolkien, is it's a ring that allows you to become invisible, right? For sake of metaphor, it's a ring that allows you to evade with absolute certainty any kind of detection and punishment, right? And Plato's question is, if there's absolutely no possibility you could ever get caught, why would you care about any rules? We've got Securities and Exchange Commissions, we got district attorneys, and so on. When I'm talking about ethics, I want to talk about the stuff that's left over after the SEC has gotten involved, right? So we have regulatory bodies. So I don't mean, this is a little old. Different things to pick on the governor about these days. But a year ago, Governor Cuomo unveiled this ethics reform, right? And I put it in scare quotes for a reason. You can see it, but I'll read it quick for you. No legislative employee, statewide elected official, or state officer or employee may receive any kind of compensation, directly or indirectly, in connection with a pending bill or resolution. And it goes on like that. And it was framed as the governor engaging in ethics reform. And every time somebody said that, I would cringe, because this is not ethics reform. This is making new laws that have the word ethics in them, right? But if you're using the law, we're not talking about ethics anymore. You're just saying, I'm going to punish you for doing this. And we've moved into something other than the way I want to talk about that E word, right? And we got something similar about the same time from the Erie County DA, right? I want to have an ability to act upon misdeeds. I want to have tools to work with when violations of the ethics code, in capitals, which may not be crimes under the penal law, but may become crimes under the ethics code. I want to have the ability to act upon misdeeds. He's looking for ways to punish folks, right? The idea is we have these laws, and if you break the laws, we have a way of dealing with you. But sometimes we have things that don't rise to the level of law. They're policies of our institution, and then I need a way to deal with you if you break those laws. My favorite here at Buff State, and mathematicians will get this, Buff State, everything we do is governed by this thing called DOPS, Directory of Policy Statements. And it is every bit as exciting as the title sounds, right? And one of the things that DOPS requires of faculty is that they hold at least 3 to 5 office hours per week. How many is at least 3 to 5? Right, it's been bugging me ever since I got here. I don't know how you give a minimum and then give a range. But the point is, we have this written into our documents. And when I was hired, it was written right into my promotion and tenure materials. You must hold at least 3 to 5 office hours per week. And the reason that's there is very much like this. If you don't do it, they can get rid of you, right? And we have a wide array of things that are designed to function that way. If you fall below this minimal threshold, it gives us the leverage we need to punish you or fire you or something, right? And we spend an awful lot of time thinking at that bare minimum level. My students, this is midterm time, my students often come to me and say, how many points can I miss on the midterm and still get a D for the class? And I'm like, wow, that's so inspiring, right? You have these lofty goals that you're going to, and I'd rather we didn't work at this. What do I have to do to avoid getting fired kind of level. And so I'll let the lawyers, the politicians, the SEC, the district attorney talk about rules that if you break, you get fired, right? In my mind, that's a whole separate set of problems. We could think of the law as putting a sort of fence around our freedom of action, right? There are various things we can do. If we go too far, the law gets involved. But within that fence the law puts up for us, there's a lot of freedom of choice. And that's, professionally speaking, at least where I live, right? That's when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about how do I make good decisions within the boundaries that the law puts up around me. So these kinds of things, despite the rhetoric of them being ethics reforms and new ethics legislation and getting tough on ethics, really is misunderstanding, in my mind anyway. What are we doing with all this stuff? Is it really about ethics? Are these decisive? Do these actually help us make decisions? I mean, yeah, hold my 3 to 5 office hours per week, right? I guess it helps me make decisions, but it doesn't help me be better at my job. Right? Think about all the professors you've ever had in your life. Now rank them best to worst, right? I'm not going to ask, but rank them best to worst. I know you can do it. Is minimum number of office hours held any part of that discussion? No. Right? And if a professor said to you, I'm really good because I always hold my 5 office hours, we're talking about something very different, right? So we want ethics principles to be teachable. We want them to help us make decisions. What are the stuff we've been talking about? What's it going to do for us? Probably not much, right? So let's talk about ethical reasoning, not memorizing the code of ethics. I don't care what your profession is. You can talk to the HR department and they'll have a set of rules for you. Things that if you break, you will get fired or you won't get a raise or something like that, right? They can call them ethics codes. They can make posters. You can have wallet cards. It's not ethics, in my not so humble opinion, right? What I want to talk to you is how to make ethically defensible decisions, how to engage in ethical reasoning. Right? So 2 flavors of ethical theory. Philosophers love to classify things, and I'm worse about that than most. So not that you need to know these, although they are really good Scrabble words, and maybe for Jeopardy, right? We can distinguish between Deontic ethics and Eretaic ethics, and those are, we can talk about the Greek origins if you want, but the basic distinction is, are you focusing on individual actions, or are you focusing on personality traits? Right? So Deontic ethics take an action. I'll give you a trivial case, and since this is being recorded, he might get upset with me, but years ago, my best friend made one of those New Year's resolutions where he wasn't going to tell any lies. Like, okay, we'll see how this goes, right? He's not going to lie. He wanted a second copy of his driver's license for reasons I won't go into, certainly not on camera. And the rule is, of course, you can't have 2 copies of your driver's license, but he's also constrained by this New Year's resolution to never tell a lie. Problem. His solution, he gives his driver's license to his roommate one morning. His roommate goes about his day. My friend goes to the DMV. When the nice lady behind the counter says, where's your other driver's license? He looks her square in the eye and says, I don't know. Okay. In his mind, that got him past the will not tell a lie resolution. And we could argue, I'm sure you can defend either position, right? Is that really a lie? Is that not really a lie? We could spend the rest of the semester parsing that. If I ask a different question, though, not did the sentence he spoke count as a lie, but was he being honest? I think we get a better consensus about what was going on there. And you can think of that as that shift. If we're focusing on whether or not his behavior violated a rule, we're thinking about it deontically. We're evaluating an individual action. And whether or not that action violates a rule, wherever those rules come from, we'll come back to that. If we're asking a more basic abstract question about the kind of person he is, or the kind of person he's being in that moment, we're operating at this Eretaic level, right? What kind of person should I be? And we might say you should be the kind of person that doesn't engage in this kind of hair splitting with the DMV. But in any case, it's a different level of analysis. Right? So, and I can talk about all the dead guys up there if you're curious. Within Deontic, again, forgive me for the classification stuff, but it helps give us our kind of toolkit here. Within Deontic ethics, we split further and talk about deontology and consequentialism. Consequentialism, as you can probably guess, focuses on consequences, right? And so it asks, did the behavior, did the action, did the decision bring about better consequences? If you'll forgive me, it takes consequences as the data. How do we evaluate what you just did? We look at the consequences. Those are the relevant bits of information for evaluating the decision or the behavior. And deontology is defined usually as in the negative, right? It's not consequentialism. Deontologists are going to say, and this comes in different flavors too, but they're going to say something other than consequences is relevant, right? Maybe some things are just plain wrong, always and forever, regardless of consequences, or moves like that, okay? So, trying to get the, and then there's another wrinkle here, and this, I'm always reluctant to say words like dominant because that suggests an empirical claim, right? Some number of folks accept this, but if you do any kind of Google search for professional ethics literature, these guys are gonna come up. Beecham and Childress. And Beecham and Childress wrote in the mid-80s, 1985, a book called Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And like all good textbooks, it's on about its 18th edition now. They keep cranking it out every year. But it's, I won't say it's the gold standard because there are competitors and there is some controversial stuff in there. But if you're going to look at a framework for professional ethics, this is a great place to start. And they don't frame it as Deontic theory, Eritaic theory. They frame it around 4 principles, right? This is me getting creative with PowerPoint, right? About as creative as I get. Beneficence, right? So trivia buffs, bene, right? This is bringing about good consequences. Your ethical responsibility is to bring about good consequences. If we drop down in the red there, it's non-maleficence, right? Maleficent is a Disney villain, right? So this is not being a Disney villain. This is not making things worse, not bringing about bad consequences. And yes, we do need the 2 of them. They are not jointly exhaustive, right? You can do nothing, right? Or you can produce a little bit better consequences. But these are 2 different ways of understanding your obligation. So if you've ever watched any television show about medicine, you've no doubt heard TV's interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm, right? Primum non nocere. That is non-maleficence, right? Don't do anything harmful. Where this gets interesting is how we start cashing out harm. So my predecessor said risk analysis is trying to figure out whether or not something bad will happen. Occupational hazard for a philosopher, my mind is screaming, what do you mean by bad? Let's talk about that, right? Because if you tell me that I'm not supposed to make things worse, and my choices are, and my stepbrother went through this, right? Pancreatic cancer, almost 0 chance of survival, excruciatingly painful way to die. So his choices at one point became essentially, I can have 2 or 3 more weeks of every day being more painful than the last and then die, or I can bring about my death now. Now, if you're framing this as don't do any harm, which of those counts as harm? Traditionally, we say, well, don't let your patient bring about his or her death, right? That counts as doing harm. But if what we're talking about is ever greater pain, you have to do some conceptual work to show how ever increasing pain doesn't count as harm, right? So these things seem relatively straightforward until you get into the weeds and try to figure out how they apply in a given case. On the right side, and there's nothing important about how I arrange them, but autonomy, right? We often talk about autonomy. Literally, etymologically, it refers to self-rule, autonomos, right? Self-rule or self-governing. And when the ancient Greeks were using it, it meant our city is autonomous, as in we're not being ruled by an empire, right? We're an autonomous city-state. We talk about that as a as an ethics value, as in you're the best judge of making your own decisions, right? Respecting your autonomy means leaving the decision up to you. So again, my stepbrother, if he wants to take his own life, respecting his autonomy would seem we want to allow him to do that. But if his physician is pledged to do no harm and sees that as an act of killing, we've got principles butting heads again, right? And then justice up there, in my slide, it was cooler because it was purple, which is the red square and the blue square. But anyway, justice is another one of these discussions, right? I've never met anybody that's opposed to justice, right? It's really easy to get people, everybody in favor of justice, raise your hand, and I get every hand in the room up, usually. But then justice is what philosophers call an essentially contested concept or an open concept, right? As soon as I start filling in details about how I'm using that word, I start losing hands, right? This is what I mean by justice, and hands start dropping. And so while I can get broad agreement, everybody loves justice, there's deep disagreement about what a commitment to justice entails in a particular situation. We're having this argument right now. I'm sort of borderline eligible for a third booster shot, right? And many of us that spend any time around ethics are asking a more basic question, like, should we be getting third shots when a huge percentage of the world hasn't had any, right? Now, very selfishly, if this is going to protect me, sure, give me my third shot. But a lot of the world, right, how much more protection does a third one give me versus how much protection would a first shot give somebody else somewhere else, right? So a commitment to justice sort of takes in all three of these, but it also stands alone, right, in its own way. And the Beecham and Childress kind of principlism says, part of being a good professional is being able to be respectful of these, to be mindful of all these, and then to make decisions in the moment. Right? I want to go back to, I think I want to go back. We'll see what the next slide holds. Oh, yes. Before we go back, sorry, I'm a pacer. The attraction of the stuff we were talking about at the beginning, the very simple, if you break the rules, you get in trouble kind of thing. They're easy to enforce, right? We do this all the time. I don't care what business you're in, right? Check off the box and you get a report. I'm a department chair. I get a supervisor's report. All the people I supervise, did they or did they not complete their Governor Cuomo mandated sexual harassment training recently, right? And yes or no, right? And it's reducing, in that case, it's pretty straightforward, but it's reducing what we think of as an ethics issue into straightforward box checking, right? And from the point of view of enforcement, from the point of view of getting somebody reported to HR, that makes perfect sense. But a tremendous amount of nuance and information is being lost when we take some rich, complicated thing and render it into a, did you do this or did you not do this? Right? I understand the attraction. Right? It seems very easy, very straightforward to just make this about rules and go down the list and did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? But just like understanding your good or bad professors in terms of whether or not they held office hours, there's a lot more to that story. Right? We can all agree that you need to spend some time in your office as a bare minimum. At least I think we can agree on that. But if we're identifying being good at your job with a certain amount of time in your office, so I guess this is depressing. I got lots of stories about sick people here, but one of my friends has valve replacement surgery scheduled for next week, and heart valve, right? And understandably, he's a little worried about this, and he's very concerned about whether he's got a good surgeon, right? It's the person carrying out this procedure, good. Now imagine he asks that doctor, and the doctor says, am I good at my job? I have never violated any of the policies of the hospital. Okay. He's missed the point of the question, right? Or she's missed the point of the question. That's often how we have these debates, right? What my friend is wondering about is, what? You tell me. When my friend asks his doctor, are you a good doctor? Is that a question about how many office hours the person holds or whether or not violated hospital policy 17? What's it about? What do we want to know? Survival rate, right? I want data. What else? No thoughts? Like my regular classes. Yes. Okay. More data. Dan, more data. Experience. It's all anybody cares about. Bedside manner. Do you care about your patients? Yeah. I really want to know, like, do you keep up on the medical literature, right? But are you telling me the truth? When you give me the risk analysis thing, are you fudging the numbers because you really want to do this procedure, or maybe you really don't want to do this procedure, right? We're back to those principles again. Does this doctor respect my autonomy enough to tell me accurate information about my prognosis? For many, many, many years, doctors didn't do that, right? There's nothing in the Hippocratic Oath that says the patient's wishes matter at all. It's, I'm the doctor, I'm the expert, I'm the professional. The patient is, I'm sorry to say, for all intents and purposes, just a puzzle I got to solve. And the whole idea, in going as recently as the 70s and 80s, the whole idea that you would ask a patient whether they wanted a procedure done was laughable. Right? What the hell would a patient know? I'm the doctor. I've decided, right? It's an overarching commitment to probably a conception of beneficence. I'm the doctor. I know what's best for my patient. I'm going to do it. Why would I ask the patient? The patient can't possibly understand what I'm talking about, right? So we introduce a principle of autonomy, right? I'm a patient. We could talk about rights. That's a different conversation, but I have a strong interest in what happens, and I want to know some things about what's going to happen to me. We talk about informed consent, right? That informed word does a lot of work. Just plain old consent is, did you sign the form? But informed consent is, do you know what it was that you were signing? And I can give you a form in Greek and get you to sign it. What does that prove? So I want to know that my doctor is conscientious. I want to know that my doctor respects my autonomy. And let's face it, my doctor might have a very different conception of what's worth it for me than I have, right? I mean, one of the things that happens in end-of-life cases is doctors and patients butting heads, right? One of the things that comes up over and over again is doctors will, and they tend to not want to do this, but they start talking about things like a life being worth living or quality of life, right? There's even an acronym for it, QALYs, quality adjusted life years. It's a version of the data analysis problem, right? So if we're being beneficence folks, we can look at hospital policies and talk about allocation of resources. Maybe it's COVID shots, maybe it's kidneys, right? And we can rank patients based on expected QALYs. How many quality adjusted life years? So maybe you're going to get lots of years, but they're going to be pretty poor quality. Maybe you're going to get a few years, but you're going to be really healthy right up until the time that you're not, right? So we try to do these kinds of metrics that are all part of that problem-solving kind of thing. But as we're talking about these discussions, whether or not you're, and I'm going to use a kind of a hokey phrase here, but whether or not your life is meaningful is not a medical judgment. Right? What the physician is an expert on is your body, your health, the procedure, the likelihood of the procedure being successful. If your question is, will I get at least 65% use of my limb back? That's a medical question. Is my life worth living when I'm limited in that way? Is in no way, shape, or form a medical question. It's a value question. Now, under the circumstances that we find ourselves, the doctor is standing there in a coat and seems to be brilliant, and that's a natural person. It sounds kind of like a medical question until you step back and say, there's no reason to think a doctor has any more expertise on this than my mom, right? Or, God help us, a philosopher, right? And so often I have friends that work in hospitals doing medical ethics. And the medical ethics, the job of the ethicist is not to say, well, if you subscribe to this theory, this is what you do. And if you subscribe to this theory, this is what you do, right? That's useless. It's to help folks think about these non-medical questions that come packaged with medical decisions, right? And I'm sure you've heard the pre-plan your funeral kinds of speeches, right? Why are you supposed to pre-plan your funeral? Because when your family's grieving your death, they're easy prey for unscrupulous salespeople, right? So think about this stuff now while you're calm and clear-headed and you can have a relatively dispassionate discussion. Don't add it to your family's burdens when they're stressed. And I'll argue the same thing when we talk about, tomorrow I'm giving a guest lecture to a colleague's class on euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. That's part of why I got it on the brain tonight, right? But the point of talking about those kinds of questions is not to figure it out, right? To maybe you do want to write the advance directive and say, under these conditions, I want my life ended, and under these conditions, I don't. But more like to get some practice in, to have thought these things through before all the additional stresses and time pressures of having to make the decision now happen, right? So part of why we study ethics and part of why we think about ethics is to equip ourselves in the leisure of a classroom or in the leisure of a healthy life to better make decisions when we don't have those luxuries. And better here doesn't mean the one Grinnell would agree with, right? Better here, I mean, I don't want to give away any trade secrets here, but I do not have the one true ethical theory waiting for you on the next slide, okay? And if I did, you wouldn't accept it anyway. The only game we have in town here is something like a kind of coherence, something like a kind of internal integrity. I want you to make good decisions where good means you can live with them. Because you're the one that's got to look yourself in the mirror, right? And what that means is not just, well, I like chocolate and I'm in favor of euthanasia, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about judgments that align with other values we've already identified that we hold, right? And so what ends up happening over a longer period of time talking about this stuff, it starts to be like a kind of discovery process, right? I don't want to make this a caricature of talking about the Greeks, right? But if you've ever heard of Socrates, that was his game, right? I'm going to ask you about different kinds of issues in the hope that a pattern of understanding will emerge, right? So think about chemistry class. You go to chemistry class and you're supposed to run your experiment in your textbook, and it's, forgive me, I mix the red stuff with the blue stuff and you're supposed to get purple stuff, right? In the chemistry textbook, you run the test, you don't get purple stuff. What's the point? Well, I was always inclined to blame my lab partner, right? Hungover lab partner, dirty test tube, something, right? Because I know the answer I was supposed to get. That was the one in the book, and I didn't get the one in the book, so I must have done something wrong. But that's a straightforward case. Imagine we're going to start heating water, right? I got my little vial of water. I'm going to put some heat under it, and this is very new to me, so I'm just supposed to graph temperature over time, right? Start graphing my water, hotter, 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 gets up there somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 degrees, and what happens? I don't want to give away the ending if you haven't done this yet, right? We get a plateau, right? It stops getting hotter. And the first time that happens to you, you think it's an error, right? And then you come to realize, no, that's the thing the book is trying to teach me, right? That's the interesting phenomenon that I'm supposed to be learning from this chemistry experiment. And we can do something analogous with ethics, right? I can ask you, and we're really good at this if you spend your life doing it, right? All kinds of case studies, variations. Here's a scenario, what would you say? Here's another scenario that's slightly different. What would you say? Here's another scenario slightly different. What would you say? And we can almost start plotting your responses, right? In this case, you gave this answer, and in this case, you gave this answer, and in this case, you give this answer, and we call them thought experiments. You adjust the case study to try to isolate the morally relevant thing, the thing that's getting you to say what you're saying. And for most people, over time, a pattern develops. And you start to say, Professor Potts, he's a sanctity of life guy. I've been talking to him a long time. Every time we have an ethics debate, his answer turns out to be some version of all life is sacred. Okay? I don't know if that's true or not, but for sake of argument, some life is sacred. On Tuesdays, right? But what ends up happening then is I can start to make predictions about Professor Potts. I can say, you know what? We've never, ever, ever talked about the death penalty. But all the other stuff we've talked about has got me pretty convinced that he's a sanctity of life guy, and a completely committed sanctity of life person would be opposed to the death penalty. I ask Professor Potts, what do you think about the death penalty? If he says, I'm opposed to it, I say, more confirmation that that I've diagnosed, so to speak, his underlying ethical principle. And in some sense, I'm helping him, right? I'm performing a service. I'm giving him a way to think more systematically about his deeply held value intuitions, right? And then somewhere down the road, hope this doesn't happen, but faced with a real practical problem, not an abstract discussion or a question about who to vote for, but something in your own life. And you can say, God, all those arguments with Grinnell are paying off. I'm really comfortable and confident that the fundamental principle I use to make ethical decisions is an appeal to something like the sanctity of life. What would that look like in this case? That's the decision I should make. And he's not doing it because I told him to. He's doing it because he told him to, right? My job was just to help him think systematically about it. But think about it the other way. What if I say, sanctity of life pots, what do you think about the death penalty? And he says, fry them all, right? And I say, wow, that's a surprise. But that's kind of like when my water temperature plateaus, right? It might be a dirty test tube. It might be an outlier. It might turn out that in some sense of this phrase, he doesn't really think that. He just thinks he thinks that. He's echoing crazy uncle whomever that always said it at Thanksgiving or something, right? And so I start talking to Professor Potts. Well, what makes you say that? How does that reconcile with other things you believe? And maybe he starts to say, oh yeah, it turns out that is not consistent with my own values. Again, this has nothing to do with agreeing with me. It's agreeing with him. And it turns out, yeah, that must be where that's coming from. That's crazy Uncle Joe. Every year at Thanksgiving, ranting about the death penalty. And that got in my head. Now that I see that, I have a framework from which to change my ethical views about this. Or another option, he's committed to it. And I talk to him some more and he says, no. And then he starts to explain why. And he says, no, I'm a sanctity of life guy except in case A, B, C, D, X, Y, and Z. But in death penalty cases, I think those folks deserve it. And I say, I need to put a little asterisk next to Professor Potts' sanctity of life principle, which is what he was tipping me off with the hand waving, right? So he's not a pure sanctity of life guy. He's we might call it an alienable sanctity of life guy. This is a normal principle, but under the right circumstances can be waived. And then the interesting question becomes, well, what are the relevant, ethically speaking, what are the relevant circumstances that would cause him to have this view? So it's not, I like chocolate, you like strawberry, right? And it's not, well, let's all just take a vote or go with what the Supreme Court says. This becomes a real kind of, I need consistency and coherence is the underlying gauge here, not what does Beecham say, right? So, blathering on some more here, I've totally lost track of where I'm supposed to be on that clock. But, all right, well, you'll leave when you're tired of me, I suppose.
Usually an hour. But...
Okay, so professional-client relationships. Let's talk about one more thing, because, look, I've had a lot of jobs in my life. I was a Kentucky Fried Chicken worker for a while. I was a Stanley Steamer carpet cleaner. I worked in a muffin factory, a carpenter. I've had a lot of jobs where you punch in the morning and you punch out in the afternoon or the evening or 4 a.m, whatever it might be, right? And what all those jobs had in common is the clock and some supervisor, somebody with authority over me pretty close by most of the time, right? If I screwed up, there was somebody there to say, you screwed up. And if I, wasn't doing my job, somebody could say, get back to work. You got time to lean, you got time to clean, right? Ever worked in a restaurant? You've heard that one 1,000 times. The professions, though, traditionally when we talk about the professions, we mean 3. We mean medicine, law, and teaching. Obviously, 21st century America, there are more things that count as a profession. And I'm going to be so bold as to say, anything that brought you here to pursue a college degree is the kind of thing that we want to call a profession. But what the professions have in common, among other things, is they usually lack that supervisor looking over your shoulder, that person demanding you punch a clock. And if the supervisor demanding you punch a clock was the thing that kept you doing your job, that's gone. Now you're a professional. Now somebody just says, come back in 3 months with the work done. And you're on your own, right? What time do you start? What time do you quit? Do you do it now? Do you take the day off? Do you go to the zoo? I don't know what you're doing, but it's a different way of structuring your day. One of the hallmarks of professionals is a great deal of autonomy over that kind of thing, how I carry out my day. I have to perform my job, but when I do that, I mean, in my own case, I can get in the office at 7 in the morning, I can stay till 10 at night, or I can come later, I can go earlier, I can work at home, lots of different combinations, right? There are some constraints. I got to show up and teach my classes on time. I got to go to a lot of meetings. I've got to produce some scholarship. But within those broad parameters, how I do my job is really up to me, right? And that's true for physicians, right? You got to treat your patients, but nobody's really watching over your shoulder. Lawyers, right? Teachers, although that all this is eroding, right? We're all dealing with more and more emphasis on document that you did your job. With teachers, it's assessment, right? With attorneys, it's being forced to codify billable hours. All of those are this problem falling out, right? It's a recognition, maybe not a recognition, it's a worry that we can't trust professionals to be professionals anymore. We've got to find some way of holding them accountable in the same way that we held the line cook at my old job accountable, right? So now my dean wants to know where I am at 9 in the morning, and my dean wants to know how many people I have in my department doing X, Y, and Z, right? There are attempts to get me to prove that I'm doing the things I should be doing, right? Rather than a recognition that I'm a professional, and part of being a professional is that I'm going to do my job, right? So this is a different kind of taxonomy, thinking about whatever profession you're going to find yourself in and how you relate to your clients. Two dynamics to parse these. How are tasks to be allocated between the parties, that is, between the client and the professional? And what's the foundation of the client's trust? Right? So if you think about the reasons you might go to a professional, right? And I'm using that term very broadly, right? Hire an architect, gardener, right? Somebody that you need to carry out some task for you. Various things you might need this person to do. This person might be necessary to analyze your needs. Maybe you don't know what it is that you need. My department moved over to Buckham Hall a couple of years ago. I had to meet with architects. They wanted to know what I wanted. And I said, I need an office, right? Had never thought about what goes into designing an office suite before. And part of their job was to talk to me until they figured out what I needed, even if I couldn't articulate what I needed, right? So their job is to help me analyze my needs and to help me identify or consider options, right? You have this need, what are ways you could bring it about? Because I don't know. Never even occurred to me to have a whole wall be a dry erase board. Now that I've got one, it's really cool. But I would never in a million years have thought to ask for that because I didn't know it was a thing, So architect says, I hear you need breakout space for your students to work on their logic homework. Yeah, that's certainly true. Ta-da, whole wall, dry erase with comfy chairs. It's brilliant, right? Educating the clients, right? Here's why you might need this, or here's how to make decisions between these cases, helping me decide among alternatives, and then helping me implement the decision once I've made it, right? And there's nothing magical about these. This is just, let's parse up the kinds of ways that you might talk to a professional. And then Faber organizes these, right? Let's talk about 5 different kinds. And the 3 on the left are the ones that really interest me. So agency relationships. In an agency relationship, the professional takes responsibility for 5. The rest are left to the client. So what's 5? Implementing the decisions. And on Faber's taxonomy, this includes everything, right? If I go to Walmart and I say, look, I'm short and that's on a high shelf, can you reach that for me? And the Walmart employee says, sure, here you go. That counts, right? I did all the other work myself. I just needed somebody to actually implement my decision, right? So that fits pretty minimal sense of professional, but that's an agency relationship. The paternalistic relationship, that's a different set of problems. The affinity relationship, those are often, I know this person's from my hometown, so I trust them, or I know this person is a member of my religious background, so I trust her, whatever it might be. Back to the left, the contractual models, division of responsibilities is specified in our contract. We're going to write it down. You're going to do these 3 things. I'm going to do these 3 things. If it doesn't work, we're going to court, right? You deliver what you're supposed to deliver, or I'm going to sue you, and I'm going to pay you what I said I was going to pay you, or you're going to sue me, right? So in the agency relationship, there's very little trust required, right? All I did was ask the tall person to get the thing off the high shelf for me. Very discreet, quick over transaction. The contractual thing, we just hammer it out, right? I sit down to buy a house. My realtor gives me 17 pages of contract. You violate any of these terms, I'm going to sue you. You can sue me, right? And we're back to dealing with the lawyers. It's the bottom one that interests us, and I think is the one that's relevant to most of the things that you might want to do with a college degree. The fiduciary kind of relationship, right? The professional is responsible for 1, 2, 3, and perhaps 5, right? So that's the professional helps me analyze my needs, helps me consider my means and my solutions. It helps educate me, the client, and maybe helps me implement my decision. But 4 is left out of this. 4 is deciding among the alternatives. Client's responsible for 4 and maybe 5. Maybe we're going to split 5. But the relevant feature here for Faber, what makes this one special, classic students, you probably recognize the root of fiduciary, right? It's fidelis, faith. A fiduciary relationship is one where my trust in you as a professional is based on your professionalism. Not, I'm going to sue you if you screw up. I mean, I might still do that, right? But I'm not saying I've got all of this codified in a contract. It's me saying I trust that you know what you're doing, and I'm going to, in some sense, get out of the way and let you do it, right? And I'm not going to try to hold you down and specify every moment of your day and everything you might do and demand micromanagement. I'm hiring you as a professional because I believe you're a professional. And my trust is based on professional standards, right? Whatever those professional standards might be in your profession. And now we're back to those ethics principles again. Now we're back to Michelle. Why do I do business with Citi? If I do, it's because I hope there's something beyond worried about the SEC, right? I want them, perhaps naively, right? I want my banking institution to value not screwing up, right? And to have some standard other than if the SEC finds out about this, they're going to kill us. So I've been fascinated over the last couple of weeks as this has come out. You might have seen all the stuff coming out on Facebook, right? And these internal documents and what Zuckerberg's been doing and how these algorithms work. And maybe this, you probably understand this far better than I do, right? How these algorithms are built to emphasize certain kinds of content, right? Apparently, an angry emoji is weighted 5 times as heavily as a simple like, right? And what drives what goes in your Facebook feed is this analysis of how important, how popular it is, right? So every time, if I'm understanding this correctly, every time I just like a post, okay, that gets a point. If I am really angry or happy or whatever, anytime I switch to emoticons, or I guess they're emojis now, but that gets weighted 5 times more heavily. Now, think about who writes reviews. I always say this about Amazon. You talk about rate my professors that way. I have very few middle-of-the-road ratemyprofessors.com evaluations. If you just went by those, everybody either loves me or hates me, right? Why? Well, yeah, the smart ones love me and the bad ones hate me, of course. No, realistically, it's simple. You gotta feel pretty strongly or you don't bother to post, right? It's like Amazon product reviews. Nobody says, yeah, it was okay, right? You write a review if you're really mad or you love the product. And if you think about, if Facebook's doing that and whatever else they're doing, what they're doing is saying the things folks get most angry or most happy about, we're going to wait the hell out of. And then we wonder why the vitriol gets ratcheted up on Facebook, because it's designed to say, wow, people are really angry about this. Let's feed them more of it, right? Big surprise. So I'll leave the algorithm details to the data science folks, right? But I'm thinking about that back in Beecham and Childress's 4 principles, right? If I'm Zuckerberg and I know this is going on and I lie about it to regulators or to the public, I've got an autonomy problem, right? I'm not respecting the autonomy of my customers. I'm not respecting the autonomy of my clients. If I'm doing this because I don't care what kind of havoc I create, I just want to maximize shareholder value, I've probably got a non-maleficence problem. I suppose you could argue, like Milton Friedman infamously did, that the only social responsibility of a business is to increase shareholder profits, right? But then tell me that, right? Don't pretend you're this wonderful company. So we've got justice problems. One of the things that Facebook has been apparently extraordinarily guilty of, they put some resources into content monitoring in the US, not so much in the rest of the world, right? So the hate speech kind of stuff that's coming out of Facebook has been dramatically under monitored and poorly monitored in other parts of the world where arguably it can do even more harm. And that suggests a justice problem, right? That they're not thinking about the differential impact of their decisions in a way that matters. So I'm really curious to see how this plays out, because I've got 15 different paper topics in mind as this plays out. But the professional thing here, that's a technical term. What we're really talking about in the fiduciary thing is respecting the client's autonomy, right? On this model, your job as a professional is to give your client all the help you can, all the information you can, the best possible, fullest picture of the situation, and then back off, right? Because if you are, Immanuel Kant notoriously argues that lying is morally on a par with murder. Now, clearly doesn't mean consequences, right? Somebody being lied to is less bad than somebody being killed. But he's a deontologist. He doesn't just focus on consequences. And he asks this question, what's going on when you lie to somebody? What is going on when you lie to somebody? If you think about it the way Kant does, when I tell you a lie, I am trying to subvert your ability to live your life, right? What is a lie? I think about the best possible way to get you to make the decision I want you to make to advance my interests. And Kant's point is that's the essence of disrespect. If you want a working definition of respect, there it is. Treating other persons as though they have their own lives to lead. And when I lie to you, I am essentially treating you like an ATM machine, right? I walk up to an ATM machine, I hit the right numbers, I get money back. I walk up to one of you, I tell you the right story about the sad puppies or whatever, and you give me money. I'm deliberately calculating and controlling the information you have for the express purpose of subverting your rationality to make my decision, right? And when you frame it that way, you say, yeah, that in terms of effects, it might not be as bad as murder. But conceptually, both of them are versions of destroying another person, right? In the lying case, it might only be for 30 seconds, but that's a difference in degree, not in kind. And so when you're talking about professional client relationships and somebody like Faber is coming back to autonomy over and over again, respecting your client's autonomy, that's what's driving it, right? It becomes this cornerstone of how do we talk about things. And then I'm winding up, I promise. Way back when we talked about Deontic ethics, the other picture is the airtag ethics, right? I want to say that my friend is being dishonest, even if he's not actually lying. And that's the fix, right? Maybe you didn't want my view, but there's my view. That's the fix, right? Now, there's a downside, right? Because I can't put this on a spreadsheet, right? What we're talking about here is a kind of institutional culture, a kind of role modeling, a kind of mentorship, right? If I'm a good teacher, and I'm not going to claim that I am, but to the extent that I'm a good teacher, it's not because I memorized Dobbs's statement on teaching, right? To the extent that I'm a good teacher, it's because I've had good teachers, and I'm sometimes deliberately and sometimes subconsciously modeling what they did, ideally thinking about it myself in my context and adapting it to the situation in front of me. But none of that fits on a wallet card or a spreadsheet, right? To embrace this, we have to be willing to admit a kind of messiness, right? I cannot tell you the 17-point scale that will determine whether somebody is an excellent physician or not. But I do want to include words like conscientiousness and veracity, right? Truth-telling, respect for my client's autonomy. I can't give them a numerical, I suppose I could give them a numerical value, right? I'm probably going to have to soon. But that's the push-pull, right? So if you want a takeaway message, we can have it nice and neat and easy and frame professional excellence as these are the 5 or 7 or 95 rules you may never violate. But there's no way to do that without it being a lowest common denominator standard, right? Because what you're not so subtly doing is saying, as long as you don't violate any of these rules, you're good. And what I want to say is, no, good is up here. Not getting fired is down here. My syllabi look like there's 17 pages, well, not look like, they are many, many, many pages now. It's years of being loopholed by students, right? Student says, well, you didn't tell us we couldn't cheat if we did it on Tuesday. Oh, crap, there's another policy that goes into the syllabus next semester, right? Constantly trying to patch these holes when what I really want to say is be a good student and you know damn well what's involved in that, right? Not don't cheat, right? Rather than these are every possible permutation that might constitute cheating. That's a game I can never win. So my choices, my push-pull are the messiness of an ethics that's worthy of the name, or continuing to proliferate rules that by their very nature suggest that all I'm really looking for is that you don't get fired and that counts as being good at your job. Right? So obviously I can keep going for several hundred more hours, but I'll shut up now and take questions. If you want.
Thank you.